Paulinians all, my dear sisters, administrators, lay collaborators, faculty, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let me begin my sharing with a short discussion of the strong verb used in the title of this segment, re-engineering. This process of reformation came up in the early 90s, but to date is still used in various ways. Since its root word is engineer, we can delimit our use of this concept to building, constructing, renovating of structures, designs, capacities, and processes which we know are part and parcel of the works of an engineer. Originally, re-engineering requires working from the ground or from a blank slate. Sabi nga natin, mas madaling gumawa ng bago kesa mag-renovate. In this cluster system we are proposing here, we are not actually starting from a blank slate. We are building up and fortifying our structures in order to reposition not only in this time of pandemic, but beyond. We know for sure that what we are experiencing now, this new landscape of education, will not end with the pandemic, but is transitory and thus needs to be addressed seriously, assessed, and re-engineered or made fit to respond to the new challenges and demands of our education ministry. The mission remains the same, but the way we respond and carry it out must be contextualized, restructured, relevant, feasible, and effective. As we re-engineer our education ministry, we take the inspiration from our Capitular Acts 2019, and I quote, "God's immense patience is matched only by His infinite creativity. Faced with so many failures of His dream of humanity, throughout the history of salvation, God never proved to be defeated. He constantly starts again the proposition of alliance, reinvents it every time we turn our back on Him." Capitular Acts 2019. Still to quote, "Failure is a fundamental human right. We must rehabilitate failure in our church and our congregations. Failures allow us to resurrect, to reinvent ourselves, to welcome the surprises of the Spirit. Do not be afraid to name and look lucidly at your failures while scrutinizing the motions of the Spirit. In the face of failure, the answer of the disciples is conversion, metanoia, and change of direction without ever losing sight of where Christ is leading us." Still from our Capitular Acts 2019. The foregoing statements from our Capitular Acts 2019 moves us to respond in tranquil daring through responsible leadership to the challenges of the new educational landscape brought about by the pandemic and the 21st century education 5.0 demands. This re-engineering is not only my task, nor of Sister Nilda's alone, but for all of us, Paulinian educators, collectively. Let us proceed to the rationale of the Spcem cluster system. The Education Ministry of the Sisters of St. Paul of Chartres, Philippine Province, exists for a decade and 16 years to date. There are 36 SPC schools distributed in the 3 islands of the country and 5 administered schools in foreign lands. The Spcem operates as a system and upholds a common strategic plan with 4 defined key result areas, namely 1. Prism, Paulinian Roots, Identity, Spirituality, and Mission. 2. OBE, Outcome-Based Education. 3. Innovations. And 4. United Systems and Management. Under KRA 4, Spcem targets to cluster the 36 schools for an intensified system-wide operation to ensure viability and sustainability and to attain the long-term goal of being one Spcem. The old adage still rings true. Together we stand, divided we fall. More than 10 years ago, in one of the gatherings for the SPC Council of Province, I proposed the idea of creating clusters among SPC schools in the country. The reasons I cited for the clustering then were the following. 1. To address the dwindling human capital in the congregation brought about by the continuing decline in the number of vocations and the increasing number of sisters getting old and sick. 2. To empower lay partners through competency building and appointment to managerial posts. And 3. To sustain delivery of quality education services through sharing of competent human and capital resources. With these arguments, the clustering proposed then was geographically based. A network of SPC schools within a region or a province will be managed by one system under one leadership. In consideration of this old proposal and the challenges brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, which currently affect our educational landscape, Spcem saw the need to revive such proposal, defining its objectives and goals while making use of the idea of clustering as a tool for repositioning SPC schools. The ad hoc committee created for this agreed that the 3 reasons mentioned above still hold true and are even made more urgent given the pandemic we are in. Following are the 2 added objectives in consideration of today's context and beyond, and in response to targets on clustering stipulated in the ministry-wide strategic plan. So, for objective number 4, to cluster the schools regardless of geographical location in acknowledgement of the present phenomenon of borderless education. And 5, to implement the cluster system by phase with the use of data science addressing short-term, medium-term, and long-term concerns, needs, for a more definite future proofing of the SPCEM. The project description. SPCEM cluster system refers to a mechanism that brings the ministry into a good position amidst many challenges. It moves forward the actualization of putting the 36 SPC schools into one system, operating in clusters with one vision and mission. Key result areas, strategic directions, and plans. This system advocates collaboration, complementation, and resource sharing, to name a few. This project is to be implemented by phase. Thus, the complete policies and guidelines shall be attained only after phase 3, or the third year of its implementation. So for the overview of the phases of implementation, please look closely at the PowerPoint presentation. You have, for phase 1, school year 2021-22, this is the current school year. Phase 2, 2022 to 2023, and phase 3, 23 to 24. So what's the basis for clustering? The capacity to help of the lead schools and the identified database short-term needs and concerns of struggling schools. And for phase 2, identified medium-term and long-term needs and concerns based on data. And for phase 3, as stipulated in the policies and guidelines of the SPCEM cluster system. So target based on KRA4. For phase 1, one pilot cluster which will initially implement the SPCEM cluster system. For phase 2, additional 2 clusters to pilot the system. And hopefully by phase 3, all clusters will implement in full the SPCEM cluster system. For leadership, during phase 1, we would like to see a leadership that will be based on the assignment received as of March 2021. But the school head or the lead school will be tasked as cluster coordinator. For phase 2, the school heads of those clusters who will not yet pilot the system will remain the cluster coordinators. The 3 clusters for piloting will be led by the sisters, assigned based on the list provided. And for phase 3, each cluster will be led by one school head, and the rest of the structure will be based on the defined policies and guidelines based on the experiences of the clusters that piloted the system. An important task to accomplish during phase 1, a consolidated short-term, medium-term, and long-term needs and concerns of schools based on data. A list of sisters who have the qualifications and competencies to head a cluster. A draft of policies and guidelines of the SPCEM cluster system based on the experiences of the pilot cluster. During phase 2, important tasks to accomplish: updated database needs and concerns of each school, final policies and guidelines of the SPCEM cluster system, and finally, on phase 3, accomplished evaluation of the SPCEM clustering system and revised guidelines and policies based on the evaluation and experiences of the clusters. Now, some details about phase 1 that we have already accomplished to date. So there was an agreed clustering per capacity to help and the identified database short-term needs concerns of struggling schools. And now for the details of Phase 1, the agreed clustering per capacity to help and identified the identified database short-term needs concerns of struggling schools. For Cluster 1, the lead is St. Paul University, Philippines, and the co-lead is St. Paul College, Ilocos Sur. The members of this cluster are St. Joseph Institute, Candon, St. William's Institute, Magsingal, St. Paul's School, Apari, St. Andrew's Catholic School, Bugalyon, and St. Isidore Learning Center, Burgos. For Cluster 2, the lead is St. Paul University, Quezon City. The co-lead is St. Paul University at San Miguel and San Ildefonso. The members are St. Paul College, Bocaue, St. Paul School, Santa Maria, St. Paul College, San Rafael, St. Paul School, General Natividad, St. William's School, San Marcelino, and St. Augustine's School, Iba. For Cluster 3, the lead school is St. Paul University, Manila. Co-lead is St. Paul College, Parañaque. The member schools are St. Paul College, Island Park, St. Paul College, Balayan, St. Paul College, Makati. For Cluster 4, we have as lead St. Paul College, Pasig. The member schools are Father Louis Chauvet Foundation School, Palacio, St. Paul College, Davao, Our Lady of Peace School, Antipolo, Mount Carmel School of Polillo. For Cluster 5, the lead school is St. Paul University, Dumaguete, and the co-lead is St. Paul University, Iloilo. The member schools are St. Paul School, Barotac Nuevo, St. Paul School, Barotac Viejo, and St. Paul School, Medellin. Our last cluster, Cluster 6, the lead school is St. Paul University, Surigao. The member schools are St. Anthony Parochial School, Manticao, Santo Niño School, Hitagum, St. Paul School, Buog, and St. Paul Academy, Goa. So I hope you all find your respective schools here and identify now the different clusters to where you belong from the different clusters mentioned. Some initial policies and guidelines. 1. The school head of the lead school shall stand as the cluster coordinator. 2. The cluster coordinator is responsible for the following: meeting the school heads of member schools for collaboration, complementation, and resource sharing in the areas of 1. Christian formation, 2. Academic and student formation, 3. Administrative and financial concerns. B. Planning and implementing cluster activities, especially those that will meet the targets stipulated in the ministry-wide strategic plan. C. Consolidating short-term, middle-term, and long-term needs of the cluster based on school data. 3. The school heads of the member schools are responsible for the following: A. Attending meeting initiated by the cluster coordinator. B. Submitting data and other things requested by the cluster coordinator. And C. Coordinating plans and initiatives with the cluster coordinator. In conclusion, SPCEM firmly believes that the proposed cluster system will help each of the schools in the needed repositioning and recalibrating of educational services in this time of pandemic and beyond. This system upholds the dream of every sister in the education ministry to be one in providing quality Catholic Paulinian education. And as Pope Francis writes in Fratelli Tutti, number 8, and with the dream of every one of us, we say, quote, "Here we have a splendid secret that shows us how to dream and to turn our life into a wonderful adventure. No one can face life in isolation. We need a community that supports and helps us, in which we can help one another to keep looking ahead. How important it is to dream together. Let us dream then as a single human family, as fellow travelers, as one SPCEM, each of us bringing the richness of her beliefs and convictions." End of quote. Thank you very much and good morning.